Senator, distinguished writers, friends and colleagues, it's a deep pleasure to welcome you here this evening to Statements, a writer's colloquium on the legacy of Yeats, which the School of English, Drama and Film at UCD has organised as part of the 2015 Yeats year, marking the 150th anniversary of Yeats's birth. We're delighted to welcome Senator Susan O'Keeffe, Chair of Yeats 2015, Martin Enright, President of the Yeats Society, and Joyce Enright from the Yeats Society, and also Professor Tanagawa, representing ISL and Yeats Japan. We acknowledge the support this evening from UCD Decade of Centenaries, and I know on behalf of the Head of School, Professor Danielle Clark, we'd very much like to recognise the very welcome place that's been given to literary events in UCD's commemorative calendar. And already that's included the Yeats and Print Symposium, organised by Dr. Lucy Collins, and special collections at UCD Library. And in 2016, we look forward to a series of events to mark the 100th anniversary of A Portrait of the Artist, led by Professor Anne Fogarty. Joycean echoes are strong this evening. For those of you who are new to Newman House, we're in the Physics Theatre where Joyce studied, and indeed where many LNH debates took place, so other evenings of great oratory. And indeed Anne tells me that Flann O'Brien would have been here either inside or heckling outside. It was John Henry Newman, founder of Catholic University, the precursor to UCD, who summoned and presided over the first meeting of the Historical, Literary and Aesthetical Society, as it was then known, we think in 1856. But it's the words and rhetoric of Yeats we're celebrating this evening. So I'd like to finish my opening words by expressing and indeed expressing my heartfelt thanks and introducing the four distinguished authors who so warmly and generously accepted the invitation to be part of this evening's colloquium. I'm very proud indeed to welcome our three poets. Firstly, Eavan Boland, Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Creative Writing at Stanford University, where she directs the Creative Writing programme there. We can congratulate her on her latest volume of poetry, A Woman Without a Country, and indeed her wonderful career from the first publication of 23 poems in 1962. Just over a week ago in the Irish Times, we read an article entitled Saving Grace, How W.B. Yeats Helped Eavan Boland to Become a Poet. So yet another reason to be grateful to our subject. Her powerful and graceful poetic voice has been a source of inspiration to so many of us, and I know I include absent as well as present friends. We especially welcome back to Dublin Lavinia Greenlaw, poet and novelist. She's published 5 collections of poetry, including Minx 2003, The Casual Perfect, and A Double Sorrow, Troilus and Cressida, her most recent work, which was shortlisted for the Costa Poetry Award. A Double Sorrow, a version of Chaucer's tragic epic, has been widely praised for the texture and compelling close focus of its retelling. Given our location in the Physics Theatre, I was reminded of a detail from Lavinia's biography that she was born into a family of scientists and that scientific subject matter forms an important and much commented on element in her work. Her acute and revealing poetic interest in perception and in the challenges and possibilities of perception mean that she's a very special contributor this evening. And thirdly, John McAuliffe. I read in John's biography, he's pithily described as a Manchester-based Listowel native. Indeed, he now lives in Manchester, where he co-directs the University of Manchester's Centre for New Writing and edits the Manchester Review and the Poetry Digest The Page. He's the chief poetry critic of the Irish Times and member of the Arts Council. He's published 4 collections with Gallery Press, and we can congratulate him on the recent publication, just in May of this year, of his 4th collection, The Way In, which probes the shared past and presence of Ireland and England in thought-provoking and illuminating ways. And then finally, a very special word of thanks to Colm Tóibín, UCD alumnus, who's chairing this evening. You know Colm's accomplishments very well, and remind you again for visitors this evening, most recently his 8th novel, Nora Webster, published in 2014, and his acclaimed study on Elizabeth Bishop, which appeared earlier this year. Colm is president of Listowel Writers Week and chair of Pen World Voices in New York, a former member of the Arts Council. I mentioned those details in particular as a chance, I think a very welcome chance, to pay tribute to Colm's generosity and the key public role he has played in so many ways. I'd particularly like, on behalf of UCD colleagues, to express how much we cherish and esteem his work and his support to us all. And I hand you over to our able chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. There was a record at home in our house in Enniscorthy. It was, we called it an LP. I suppose nowadays it's called vinyl. But anyway, it was Micheál Mac Liammóir, and he was reciting poems and speeches. And the record included the 1916 proclamation and some poems by Yeats. And two of these poems, which I heard first when I was 11 or 12, are still in my mind as recited by Mac Liammóir. One was Red Hanrahan's song about Ireland. The old brown thorn tree breaks into high over common strand, under a bitter black wind that blows from the left hand. Our courage breaks like an old tree in a bitter black wind and dies. But we have hidden in our hearts the flame out of the eyes of Kathleen, the daughter of Houlihan. And there was a wonderful way Mac Liammóir saying common strand. It was very beautiful. The other poem that I remember him reciting was Easter 1916, which he recited it was recited in such a way by Mac Liammóir as to sound natural, almost part of speech, almost close to a folk song or something that could not have been composed by merely one person. And it was only later I noticed how uncertain the poem was and how much it was an argument with the self or with others, and only later that I puzzled over the lines and what if excess of love bewildered them till they died. And I still puzzle over those lines. And it's easy to say that poems are there to be read and reread, but in the case of Yeats, some poems become even more startling or complex or audacious or even more simple when read at different times and in different lights. Some of the high-toned public poems seem to have their counterparts in poems to be whispered or read in lamplight, or when the surrounding silence is at its most pure. Thus, September 1913 has softer and more personal, less certain echoes in The Fisherman, or In Memory of Major Robert Gregory, has a more anxious and melancholy counterpart in An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. And the recognisable terrain of Sailing to Byzantium has a more mysterious and hidden shadow in the more shadowy poem Byzantium. Yeats had a way of making a statement which seemed factual, a way of setting the scene, just setting up something that he noticed. An example is the opening of the stairs nest by my window. It just seems as though he wanted to notice something. The bees build in their crevices of loosing masonry, and there the mother birds bring grubs and flies. It's only later you realise that the opening lines contain haunting and significant images of creation and disturbance, decay and regeneration. This is the world that will go on, will renew itself as the masonry loosens, despite some 14 days of civil war. Sometimes it seems as though the opening lines of a Yeats poem are a sort of stage direction, a way of setting a scene so the poem can begin then, as in The Light of Evening, Liss Adele, or The Unpurged Images of Day Recede, or Around Me the Images of 30 Years. In any case, the poems yield more the more attention we pay to them. They've been chiselled into our culture, which is all the more reason why, 150 years after the poet's birth, we should look at them line by line, perhaps, accept their power, but analyse how the power emerges, what it is that makes them speak to us still, in their heightened rhetoric and also in their whispered, hard-won truths. So it's an absolute honour to be here to ask, in this order, Eavan Boland, John McAuliffe and Lavinia Greenlaw to respond to various individual poems by W.B. Yeats. So Eavan can... Yeah.
Well, thanks to Colm, I'm delighted to be here and to speak a little bit about Yeats and to choose. We've each chosen 3 poems. One of them that I chose, I'm really going to just excerpt from, but I'll try a little bit to speak about why I chose them and what they fit together for me about Yeats. Many years ago in London, I met the American poet Adrienne Rich, and she said it was Yeats that taught me to be a political poet. And I don't think she's the only, I'm sure not the only American poet who would say that. And I've always been interested in how Yeats became a political poet, because he had a very uncertain path to it. The first poem I chose is one of the most troubled of the political poems he wrote. It is commented on, but it's often overlooked. And the poem is called The Grey Rock. And it's a very odd quilting together of a new and old style. It's written in 1913. So it's just on the threshold of the events that are going to put a big amount of pressure on him, coming up to the 1916, all of that. And he's still trying to find a theatrical deflection. And so what he does is he writes a poem called The Grey Rock. And The Grey Rock is looking in both directions. First of all, it's looking at his old friends in London, who, when you look back at them, are really not exactly the way he portrays them. Lionel Johnson and Ernest Dowson are presented by him as great poetic purists. When you look at them, they're not exactly that. But they remained in his mind as ideals of people who wouldn't be corrupted. So he's going to begin talking to them, and he's going to talk to them, but he's also going to make this fanciful, odd story of a woman who goes into a room of gods. And she says to them, you have to take my part. I've been betrayed by this man that I loved. You have to stand by me because I'm partly a goddess. So the opening of it in these lines is, poets with whom I learned my trade, companions of the Cheshire cheese. Here's an old story I've remade, imagining it would better please your ears than stories now in fashion, though you may think I waste my breath pretending there can be passion that has more life in it than death. And so the woman goes into the room, and all the gods are indifferent at first to what she's telling them. But she says, you have to listen to me. There was this young man I fell in love with, and I told him, because I loved him, because I was goddess, this is a little bit the Achilles story, he can remain invisible in every battle. I gave him a cloak. I told him he'd never be injured, that there was a battle that was going to happen. And he was going to be unhurt. And so what happened is that she's going to remain with this young man who will never enter the battle. But that's not what happens. Yeats says, we should be dazed and terror-struck if we but saw in dreams that room, those wine-drenched eyes. And he says, I knew a woman none could please, because she dreamed when but a child of men and women made like these. So he's looking at Maud Gonne, he's looking at the icons of his life. And he then pays them this tribute, which will be remembered and quoted forever about William Yeats. He says, since tavern comrades you have died, maybe your images have stood mere bone and muscle thrown aside before that roomful or as good. You had to face your ends when young. 'Twas wine or women or some curse, but never made a poorer song, that you might have a heavier purse, nor gave loud service to a cause, that you might have a troop of friends. You kept the muses' sterner laws, and unrepenting faced your ends. So William Yeats is setting up the bar that he believes is necessary in the face of the pressures to come. When I say that the Grey Rock is the map of how troubled his progress is to the political poem, there is no other poem that shows it so clearly. So what happens is that she goes back to talk to the gods, and then she tells them what happens to this young man she loves. And she said, when this day, Murray, the King of Ireland's son, foot after foot was giving way. He and his best troops back to back had perished there, but the Danes ran, stricken with panic from the attack, the shouting of an unseen man, and being thankful, Murray found, led by a foot-sole dipped in blood, that had made prints upon the ground, whereby old thorn trees that man stood, and though when he gazed here and there, he had but gazed on thorn trees, spoke, who is the friend that seems but air, and yet could give so fine a stroke, Thereon a young man met his eye and said, because she held me in her love and wouldn't have me die, rock-nurtured Aoife took a pin and pushing it into my shirt, promised that for the pin's sake no man should see to do me hurt. But there it's gone. I will not take the fortune that had been my shame, seeing king's son what wounds you have. 'Twas roundly spoke, but when night came, he had betrayed me to his grave, for he and the king's son were dead. So Yeats sets up this tremendous moment when the King of Ireland's son meets the young man who could have chosen invisibility and immortality, and he throws in his lot with the King of Ireland's son, and they both die. And I think that, I think the poems have hotspots. If you could x-ray them, they would have a hotspot. And the moment when the King of Ireland's son and that young man meet is one of the hotspots of the Grey Rock. And it will last right through his political poems, even though he disapproves, even though he wants to be free of this. He will not forget that the King of Ireland's son and the young man joined common cause. And then he says at the end, I have kept my faith, though faith was tried to that rock-born, rock-wandering foot, and the world's altered since you died, and I am in no good repute with the loud host before the sea that thinks sword strokes were better meant than lovers' music. Let that be, so that the wandering foot's content. So he testifies at the end that he's with Aoife, that he would stay with the Grey Rock, but the middle of the poem, it doesn't look like he will. So this is a troubled, contentious poem that shows his mind is with the aesthetics, but that his heart will always be drawn to the activist and revolutionary side as well. The Wild Swans at Coole is one of the most perfect and elegant of the mid-careers. It comes out of the 1919 volume, which takes its name. But by that time, he has made it clear, after the Grey Rock, that his project is the creation of a self, not of a style. And by now, he's well into that enterprise. It's going to be a self he creates. It's not just going to be a style. But it's remarkable as the work progresses, the style and the self are going to make a very sharp separation. His style, like in The Wild Swans, which I'll read, it's a short poem, accrues power. It moves from ornamental early work to the very tough syntax of the middle and late poems. But by contrast, the self he discovers through the style loses power in every great poem as he gets older. It becomes more human, more fearful, more aware of its limits. And I think of The Wild Swans at Coole as that great bridge poem where he allows human limitation and weakness to come ahead of style. The Wild Swans at Coole. The trees are in their autumn beauty. The woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. Upon the brimming water, among the stones, are 59 swans. The 19th autumn has come upon me since I first made my count. I saw before I had well finished all suddenly mount and scatter wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. I have looked upon these brilliant creatures, and now my heart is sore. All has changed since I, hearing at twilight the first time on this shore the bell beat of their wings above my head, trod with a lighter tread. Unwearied still, lover by lover, they paddle in the cold, companionable streams or climb the air. Their hearts have not grown old. Passion or conquest wander where they will, attend upon them still. But now they drift on the still water, mysterious, beautiful. Among what rushes will they build? By what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes, when I awake someday to find they have flown away? And the final poem is The Curse of Cromwell, and it is really one of the very last poems that William Yeats writes, and he describes it in a letter I think to Lady Dorothy Wellesley as, I'm in the voice of a wandering poet. But really, Yeats's great achievement is to have strengthened, as I said, a style, and to have allowed a self to become more and more vulnerable, less and less exempt from human suffering, even though he wrote well enough to exempt himself. And this really beautiful, desolate poem is very near his own death. You ask what I have found, and far and wide I go. Nothing but Cromwell's house and Cromwell's murderous crew. The lovers and the dancers are beaten into the clay, and the tall men and the swordsmen and the horsemen, where are they? And there is an old beggar wandering in his pride. His fathers served their fathers before Christ was crucified. Oh, what of that? Oh, what of that? What is there left to say? All neighbourly content and easy talk are gone, but there is no good complaining, for money's rant is on, and he that's mounting up must on his neighbour mount. And we and all the muses are things of no account. They have schooling of their own, but I pass their schooling by. What can they know that we know that know the time to die? Oh, what of that? Oh, what of that? What is there left to say? But there's another knowledge that my heart destroys, as the fox in the old fable destroyed the Spartan boys, because it proves things both can and cannot be. That the swordsmen and the ladies can still keep company, can pay the poet for a verse and hear the fiddle sound, that I am still their servant, though all are underground. Oh, what of that? Oh, what of that? What is there left to say? I came on a great house in the middle of the night, its open lighted doorways and its windows all alight, and all my friends were there and made me welcome too. But I woke in an old ruin that the winds howled through. And when I pay attention, I must out and walk among the dogs and horses that understand my talk. Oh, what of that? Oh, what of that? What is there left to say? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. That was terrific. I've also decided to start by looking at a poem from Responsibilities. Eavan mentioned that the poem The Grey Rock was written in 1913, and the book comes out in 1915, 100 years ago. And for me, it's a really fascinating book, because it's a book which I think starts to drift away from Ireland to some extent. Yeats is spending more and more time in England. He's touring the US, but when he's touring the US, he is no longer on the Irish-American circuit, which Padraig Pearse is on at the same time as him, and instead he's touring the universities. So I think there's a sense that his sense of his audience and who he is as a poet is changing. And of course, a year after the book is published, with The Rising, he gives all that up again. But there's a little moment in 1915 where I think he's beginning to reconceive of his place as a poet. The poem that I'm going to read first is called The Cold Heaven. And I think of Yeats, the early poems, as being to do with gardens and graves and islands and water to some extent, but the elements that are underneath him. And The Cold Heaven is a poem which looks up. And in that poem, I think it's a poem as if he looks up for the first time. And I'm going to make two references to the Coen brothers this evening. Do any of you remember Miller's Crossing? And the end of Miller's Crossing, where the camera looks up and goes down through the trees and you can just see the sky for a minute. Suddenly I saw the cold and rook-delighting heaven that seemed as though ice burned and was but the more ice. And thereupon imagination and heart were driven so wild that every casual thought of that and this vanished and left but memories, that should be out of season with the hot blood of youth and love crossed long ago. And I took all the blame out of all sense and reason, until I cried and trembled and rocked to and fro, riddled with light. Ah, when the ghost begins to quicken, confusion of the deathbed over, is it sent out naked on the roads, as the books say, and stricken by the injustice of the skies for punishment? It's a real reckoning of a poem and a reckoning up of his poem, of the poems I think he had written until then. And he wrote about it in 2 or 3 poems which follow it in Responsibilities, which also look up at the sky, the Magi and the dolls to a lesser extent. And the note he has about them I just thought was interesting because it says, while lecturing in Dublin, it came into his head that all thought among us is frozen into something other than human life. And I think the impulse in Yeats's poems, the sort of ceaseless creativity in poem after poem and book after book, is it trying to break up that frozenness and always trying to remake what's around him into new shapes. The second poem that I'm going to read is the first poem in the Tower, Sailing to Byzantium, which we all know. You know, it's such a wonderful poem. But one of the things I'd like to say is that this is Yeats in Ireland, having worked as a senator, having a more central place in the culture maybe than he had before. And immediately, rather than talking about Dublin or Sligo, it's Byzantium that he's talking about. And I think it's that same sense of that response to what people know. And that's never what he's interested in. What he's always interested in is being on the cusp of something that he doesn't know anything about. And that kind of risk is at the heart of the poems. That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages, standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal, it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium, of what is past or passing or to come. So there's one of the small thing there, that thing at the end where he says to sing to lords and ladies. There's no comma after Byzantium, but I put one in because it's such a beautiful thing what he sings of to everybody at the end of that poem. And the moment of the poem, which is always looking backward, aware of where it's standing, and then also looking forward and projecting into the future, is that other kind of wonderful creative impulse in Yeats that's always looking away from what he knows. Colm has already read the stairs nest by the windows opening lines beautifully, but I'm going to just read it quickly again, and I'm going to stop towards the end, because one of the other things that happens in these poems is you think, well, he would have been fine with just that. And many of us in a Yeats poem would think, why use all that in one poem? You could make 2, 3, 4, 5 poems out of this. And it's one of the things that Colm asked us to think about as well, was the idea of statement in Yeats. And I love that idea that the poems are stating things which don't have an inbuilt response, and which look to resound within his readers and to create echoes in us. The stairs nest by my window, and it's his bedroom window. He writes to Olivia Shakespeare about the stair and the starling, which used to nest outside his bedroom window, because she had sent him, and I've never known how she could have done this. She sent him a nest of yellow canaries. And I was just thinking, the postal service is not what it was. And of course, Yeats was fascinated with animals his entire life long. As a child, he was always a collector in his pockets of small creatures, and a sketcher of them as well. The bees build in the crevices of loosening masonry, and there the mother birds bring grubs and flies. My wall is loosening. Honeybees come build in the empty house of the stair. We are closed in, and the key is turned on our uncertainty. Somewhere a man is killed, or a house burned, yet no clear fact to be discerned. Come build in the empty house of the stair. A barricade of stone or of wood, some 14 days of civil war. Last night they trundled down the road, that dead young soldier in his blood. Come build in the empty house of the stair. I'm going to stop there for a minute. Yeats edited the Oxford Book of Verse 10 years or so after he wrote this poem, and it's a famous introduction where he says that passive suffering is not a fit subject for poetry, and he writes off a lot of really terrific poems about the First World War when he does so. But in the same essay, he says that he thought that the poetry of his later years, the poetry of young writers around him, was too much a poetry of statement. And he said, what will happen in the future? Will we just have a poetry of fact? And it's a lovely thought, because Yeats, of course, is a poet of metaphor and of transformation and of invention, and definitively not a poet of opinion in the kind of derogatory way that he talks about it there. So having given us this poetry of fact, beautiful poetry of fact, we then get, we had fed the heart on fantasies, the hearts grown brutal from the fair, more substance in our enmities than in our love. O honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. And I suppose I think that those statements all of a sudden give what Colm said, this sort of resonance to what these images can speak to in the Civil War around him. I'm going to finish by reading The Black Tower, which is a poem that Yeats wrote a week before he died. And it's It calls back to the tower. It must do. He must be thinking of the tower when he thinks of the Black Tower. And it's also sort of wild in the same way those other, it's in a different way maybe to the way those other poems are. It's a wild and inventive poem, again. And it begins, say that, the men, and all of a sudden you're going, he's inventing something, you know. Well, let's say that. And you're into the world of some kind of theoretical invention, which he's going to work out for you. And I loved this poem, and it was one of the first poems of Yates's that I loved because it's apocalyptic and it's sort of doomy, and it's like the heavy metal end of. I forgot to mention No Country for Old Men as my other Coen brothers reference. Sorry, yeah, but you all knew that. And I think that if they were to make a movie of a small band of warriors separated from the main troop in World War II, they should call it the Black Tower. Okay, so that's my. I'm claiming that. The other thing I think when I read it first is that it's a very cheap bottle of white wine, the Black Tower. So I remember thinking that about it as well. And Yeats, at the end of his life, was still shouting, I think, is what you can say. He's still trying to involve himself in arguments. And a poem like this is it's like he's honking his horn. There's a traffic jam somewhere else, but in case anybody pays too much attention to that, he's here making noise on the other side. In France as well. The Black Tower. Say that the men of the old Black Tower, though they but feed as the goat herd feeds, their money spent, their wine gone sour, lack nothing that a soldier needs, that all are oath-bound men, those banners come not in. There in the tomb stand the dead upright, but winds come up from the shore. They shake when the winds roar. Old bones upon the mountain shake. Those banners come to bribe or threaten, or whisper that a man's a fool, who when his own right king's forgotten, cares what king sets up his rule. If he died long ago, why do you dread us so? There in the tomb drops the faint moonlight, but wind comes up from the shore. They shake when the winds roar. Old bones upon the mountain shake. The tower's old cook that must climb and clamber, catching small birds in the dew of the morn when we hale men lie stretched in slumber, swears that he hears the king's great horn. But he's a lying hound. Stand we on guard, oath-bound. There in the tomb, the dark grows blacker, but wind comes up from the shore. They shake when the winds roar. Old bones upon the mountain shake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John and Eavan and Colm. I'm delighted to be here. My relationship with Yeats is peculiar. It's rather like my relationship with Bob Dylan, in that I would never describe myself as a Bob Dylan fan, but I seem to own sort of 12 albums by him. And I have the same relationship with Yeats. When people ask me which poets are important to me, Yeats doesn't really come very quickly to mind, yet he seems to be there either in his own right or through other people, both before him and after him, and who led me back to him or towards him. So it was a great pleasure to be asked to do this. We've heard a lot about Yeats's perpetual unsettlement of himself and his work, and it was lovely to get some of those phrases. And Eavan talked about his uncertain path towards his role as a political, or towards his political poetry. And John has ended it with this sense of this insistence on being shaken. I'm particularly interested in where Yeats achieves those moments, or how he kind of negotiates what he called the moment when we're both asleep and wake. The purpose of rhythm, he said, it has always seemed to me, is to prolong the moment of contemplation, the moment when we are both asleep and awake. So this constant sustaining of tension through unsettlement. When I was a teenager and pretending not to listen to Bob Dylan, I was a punk. And the first Yeats poem I was probably conscious of was He Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven. And that was definitely a hippie poem. I mean, treading softly on your dreams, definitely a hippie thing. So I wasn't at all interested in that. But beside that poem, I discovered He Wishes His Beloved Were Dead, from 1899, The Wind Among the Reeds, same book. Were you but lying cold and dead, and lights were paling out of the west, you would come hither and bend your head, and I would lay my head on your breast, and you would murmur tender words, forgiving me because you were dead. Nor would you rise and hasten away, though you have the will of wild birds. But know your hair was bound and wound about the stars and moon and sun. Oh, would, beloved, that you lay under the dock leaves in the ground, while lights were paling one by one. And it's one of those fantastic great love poems that is a poem of desperation and anguish and really rage at the way this person is possessed, and has so taken him over that he needs to. The only way he would feel content is if she was so fixed that she no longer existed, that she was actually underground in the absolute dark. And his kind of rhetorical approach here reminds me very much, looking forward to a Weldon Keys sonnet called To My Daughter, which starts with this idea of this lovely, beautiful girl and goes through to all the terrible things that might happen to her and concludes, I have no daughter, I desire none. So it's the fear of feeling, really, that this poem shows us. And what I love as well is the constant calibration of the language and how it changes. So we start with simple, kind of actively working towards modernism with phrases like the lights were paling out of the west. And then suddenly we're back in quite archaic, come hither, I would bend your head, I'd lay my head on your breast, you would murmur tender words. I mean, it's cliche. And then he says, because you're dead. So he completely kind of abruptly, he gives us this very anodyne version of completion with this person, and then upends those cliches. And even when he's describing her, that push of the W's, W is a very wobbly sound, and you get the will of wild birds, and then the ow, the bound and wound, and it all kind of rather unravels in the way that feeling unravels, and reminds me very much of a great cusp of modernism poem, Charlotte Mews' Farmer's Bride, which takes off from traditional ballad form and ballad subject and completely subverts it and has the kind of bleed into abstraction of a true early modernist poem. This poem also brings to mind Rilke's Orpheus Eurydice Hermes, in which she unravels through her deadness. And the great push of Rilke's argument in that poem is she can't take on the role that Orpheus gives her as a kind of tragic heroine because she is exempt from tragedy. She's exempt from narrative. She's dead. And Rilke says she was already rude. And then at the end of this poem pushes this woman into the absolute and instant dark, while Yeats, or the poet, remains in this gradual dimming of the lights paling one by one. It's a poem about wanting something clear and reliable, and black and white, light and dark, but it's also about wanting, it's recognizing how quickly we exhaust language. I mean, he gets exhausted in the middle of the poem and having sort of gone rather over the top and pulls back. So that was the poem that it also reminds me of a fantastic little lyric by Thomas Campion. It's a very sour little lyric called Tune Thy Music to Thy Heart. Look it up it's 4 lines or so, it's great.
The next poem I wanted to talk about, I have very mixed feelings about and always have, No Second Troy. John mentioned the desire we sometimes have with Yeats to think, don't, stop now. And I very much feel that about this poem, that it starts, as Yeats often does, absolutely in the moment. Why should I blame her that she filled my days? And then has that plunge into the back of the next line with misery. And all kinds of people come to mind. McNeice comes to mind in this poem because of the way the enjambment and the broken phrases kind of allow meaning to fills meaning with air, really, and lets it kind of take other shapes. And he's got this Browning technique as well of driving the back of the line. So if you listen to it, why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? What could have made her peaceful with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a Titan bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? Why? What could she have done, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn? I so much wanted to not speak the last line, because I think Troy is in there. You've got it in the title. You could even not have it at all, and this would be a wonderful poem. But the drive towards making that explicit, for me, over-embroiders the poem, or it freezes what somehow it kind of fixes too much for me the real wonderfully complicated feelings that Yeats is so good at evoking. And again, we have the series of very different kinds of language. It brings to mind a sonnet by Michael Drayton that you know, called Since There's No Help, Come Let Us Kiss and Part, which reads like a perfectly made, seamless, coherent sonnet. But when you look at the shifts in register and language between each of the quatrains and the couplet, it just does this. It starts with a shrug, and then it's as if you've got somebody sort of shrugging and then running after someone in the street and then threatening to kill themselves and then begging to come back. And that's the kind of undercurrents, that under the surface of musical language that Yeats is particularly good at. But I've never sort of settled with this poem, and please argue with me about it. The rhymes, interestingly, are very clean and complete. They're very days, ways, late, great. They're very, very neat. But there is no conclusion. There is no final couplet. And this is all questions. And it very much has that sense of, and another thing, which makes me kind of perhaps forgive the imbalance I feel in the explicitness of the symbolism. The poem of Yeats's that I love most is Leda and the Swan, because I think it's an extraordinary poem of perception, and the matching of the language to the point of view and the physicality, the physical context of what's being received or understood, and how it takes us through it is just, well, for me, it's sort of endlessly fascinating. Leda and the Swan. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill, he holds her helpless, breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? And it starts with a sudden blow, and then this caesura, so it is the shock of being hit by something. This is the god as swan, immediately raping this woman. The great wings beating still, so you've got this, the reverberations of the shock waves coming at you, the staggering girl. She's not this isn't pretty, she's staggering. And then really confusingly, in the same line, her thighs caressed. The whole way through the poem, pleasure and horror, seduction and attack are wonderfully confused. And even down to the sound, so you've got this through particularly the first quatrain, you've got this ugly B, this b, which is very jabbing and gaping as well. And you've got the sibilance, the hiss of the swan, but that goes into this word caressed. So you've got the violent, cold nature of the swan in the warmest word in that line. And as well, at the same time, it's full of double L's, the still and bill. And so you've got a lulling feeling. She's being seduced and she's also being stunned. And it goes on into this wonderful description of shock, how those terrified, vague fingers, if you've ever been so scared that you suddenly don't know how to use your hands, terrified and vague, your hands become vague. It works incredibly well, I think. So there's always this slight abstraction where he talks about, say, her thighs caressed not by the swan but by the dark webs. So already it's in her shock and the intensity of the situation, things are becoming abstracted into things, and web also bringing that sense of entrapment. I've written all over this, so I don't really know where to go because I can keep talking about it. And as well in that hiss of the S's that run through it, it's as if the air has gone out of the world. It's as if she, Leda, her life is trying to push its way out of life. There's this sense of her kind of disappearing or wanting to, her loosening thighs. I mean, that's a very reactive and neutral, or not neutral, but ambiguous word, loosening. How can the body laid in the white rush, that's the purest abstraction in the poem, this white rush that the god has become, this amorphous, ubiquitous thing. I mean, and how can the body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? And at the same time, he interrogates Leda, he protects her, and he excuses her. And then we have, in the turn, the volta of the sonnet, we have the shudder, the moment of both conception, perhaps, because Leda went on to lay 4 eggs, one of whom became Helen and led to the Troy, and sort of on the consequences stretch out in that broken line. The shudder, the final reaction, the reverberations are happening. And Yeats does this very interesting thing where he breaks that, and Agamemnon dead, and there's this blank after that, and you feel about those consequences stretching out wordlessly and endlessly. And then this phrase, which is the most human one, and is the heart, for me, of what the poem is intended to have us, what we are supposed to find in ourselves that reverberates, and that is the sense of being so caught up. It's such an ordinary phrase. We all know what it means at all levels and on all scales to be caught up. So mastered, and then of course his language veers back, so mastered by the brute blood of air, those savage bees again, and that sort of unopposable, indefinable power that's just taken her over. And then those kind of big abstract nouns, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? So these big words, knowledge and power, and he just throws them up in the air. And then we come back to this very, very cooling word, indifferent. We don't even know where she falls. She's just let go, the indifferent beak. And we think it's not about her, it's not about him, it's not about Yeats, it's not about us, it's about being so caught up. And this is how I think a statement, is made. It's an argument. And Yeats said about poetry that he said, a quarrel with other people is rhetoric. A quarrel with yourselves is poetry comes out of a quarrel with yourselves and yourself. And I think that what he manages to do is have this quarrel in a way that reminds us of quarrels we have with ourselves, of where we have been so caught up, and uses actually brilliantly many aspects of rhetoric to do so, with these veering registers and reaches of language and the shifting of perspective. So in the first 4 lines, we are Leda, we are Zeus, we're sort of everywhere. It's an incredibly modern, mobile poem, and the push and pull rhyme scheme as well, up, drop, air, there, push, rush, and the sort of helplessness of response. That's the quarrel we have with ourselves here, that we cannot help but have this response. And I'm just going to finish by very quickly reading a later poem from Words for Music, perhaps, After Long Silence, in which I feel that he expresses something that really for me, I mean, well, if I could borrow a phrase from Eavan, she said that he became more aware of poetry's limits. And when I heard you say that, I thought, yes, that's really what this poem speaks of. After long silence, this kind of faltering metrics and this collapse of rhetoric, of statement, of argument. Speech after long silence. It is right, all other lovers being estranged or dead, unfriendly lamplight hid under its shade, the curtains drawn upon unfriendly night, that we descant, and yet again descant upon the supreme theme of art and song. Bodily decrepitude is wisdom. Young, we loved each other and were ignorant. So you've got that moment in the middle where it is the big Yeatsian liftoff with descant, descant upon the supreme theme of art and song. And he makes the poem so cleverly, you cannot help but sound deeply ironic when you say that line. There's no way you can read that line and sound as if you mean it. And then just those two killer last lines, which pull us back out of argument and into the effect of the poem. And it's making the hair go up on the back of my neck. Bodily decrepitude is wisdom. Young, we loved each other and were ignorant. Thank you.
Eavan, I want to ask you two questions, which I think might be the same question, which is, could you talk about what happened to the political poem in America in that time of the Vietnam War, when that argument that Robert Duncan begins to have with Denise Levertov, where they just could you give us an account of that argument, and just further, if you could take it one step further into your own position in relation to that argument.
Well, my position, I mean, I think anybody's position would be very caught in this. You're really right to pick this up. This is a real turning point in the political poem. Denise Levertov was an English poet who went to America, became very much part of American poetry in something called the Black Mountain School. And that was really run out of the West Coast. It was coming out of San Francisco, and involved in that school was a man called Robert Duncan. And Robert Duncan and herself, throughout the 50s and the early 60s, were tremendous friends, and they have a very moving correspondence about poetry and language, both of them hugely influenced by William Carlos Williams, especially Levertov. And it's just a very touching, powerful companionship. And then the Vietnam War begins, and it begins to ramp up in about 65, 66. And Levertov is absolutely activist. And she believes that the poet should be involved and should be morally engaged as an anti-war activist. And Robert Duncan hates this. And he writes to her, and at first the letters are somewhat a critique of political involvement for the poet. And then they have this searing break and row. And Duncan says something which I've never forgotten, really troubles me to this minute. He writes to her and says, "You're destroying yourself as a poet. What you're doing is wrong. The poet's task is not to contest evil, but to imagine it." And of course, in doing that, Duncan roils the entire waters of the political poem. What does that mean to imagine evil? What does it mean to contest it? And that remains a question that sort of hangs in the air for American poets. They're faced with that very difficult war. And I don't think that there's an easy answer to Duncan's contention. I think some poets, who's going to imagine evil and say that's all they need to do, but who's going to contest it? So I think the political poem got stuck on that. And I think that it has, you know, if I were to choose the political poem of the Vietnam War, it would be, without a doubt, Yusuf Komunyako's great poem, Facing It. Yusuf Komunyako goes to the Vietnam War Memorial, and he begins it by saying, I said I wouldn't, damn it, and he sees his face in the memorial, and then he wonders, you know, what is his face taking away from those names? The private leverage of that moment of grief and regret seems to me to be powerful, but not to resolve what Duncan says.
I mean, these are issues that are all raised by Yeats.
Yes, absolutely.
At that moment that you mentioned, when he begins. John, there's something I want to ask you about, which is, you were talking that, you know, towards the end he was still shouting. Whereas Eavan had raised the issue that, you know, when you look at a poem like The Wild Swans of Cool, and even, you know, a tattered coat upon a stick, the whole idea of self-deprecation, of the self being open to its limits, and almost beginning to celebrate its limits and age. I wonder if this mattered to the poetry that men wrote, personal poetry that men wrote after Yeats, which of course is after the Second World War as well, and is something that you're conscious of as a poet, of a way in which you present yourself in a poem, with its limits, rather than, say, being in any way heroic or ever being able to be heroic.
Thank you. You know, Yeats is such a dramatic poet, isn't he? And he cycles in and out of that kind of domestic scene with the stairs nest by my window. He immediately follows something which has that, you know, that brutal statement in it, but it is a gentle poem. But it's followed by a fantasy of Louis Fuller. It's kind of amazing phantasmagoria is brought back into play. So I think poem by poem, that sense of limit coexists with something other. He's arguing, you know, it's that quarrel, you know, that Lavinia mentioned as well. So both elements are there in Yeats. I was at an Elizabeth Bishop conference yesterday in Sheffield, where both Eavan and Colm and Lavinia, all three of you are being spoken of in different parts of it there. But I was reading Bishop again in the lead up to that, and what she had to say about Yeats. And she writes about Yeats, and what she loves in Yeats, she says, is his magnificence. And I think I treasure that more than the sense of limit in him. I think we have lots of ideas of limit in poetry at the moment. And so I think it's something for us to try again. I don't know anybody really who is doing it, that sense of being able to adapt ballads to take even the story of the Grey Rock. Like, very weirdly, the story of the Grey Rock, the main character he calls Aoife, but she's from Clare and her name is Evil. You know, so but obviously he can't work that into the English because he would be too close to imagining evil. But so yeah, that sense of the domestic is not something I go, or the limit in Yeats is not something, I suppose, that I go to him for. I don't know if you do, Eavan.
John, I was taken, I mean, I think Colm could probably answer this better than me, but, you know, when you describe Elizabeth Bishop as saying what she likes was his magnificence, I just wonder, is that a compliment from her? Because,
yes, I know.
You know, she was very, very astute about that kind of thing. And, you know, when Robert Lowe wrote this, you know, Life Studies, and he puts all his relatives into it, and it's a great harrowing book. And she writes to him, she said, you know, I've got relatives too, she said, but I don't think people would be interested in them. So I'm not sure, I didn't think that, you know.
Yeah, it's actually Yeats's letters that she's reading when she talks about this, like the fact that he was fighting all the time.
Yes.
Well,
Sure.
Lavinia, when you were doing your deconstruction of No Second Troy and Leela and the Swan, I was acutely, I don't know if anyone else was aware of that you were almost writing a poem as you were doing that, and you were working out what words you can and cannot use now, and whether you can refer to Troy in a poem now. And you were also doing something very interesting, which is the looking at the well-made poem, at the way in which, for example, syllables are repeated or certain sounds repeated, rhyme sounds are used, abstract words are used against concrete words. And I was just wondering, one of the things one of the ways Yeats mattered was that he mattered not only in Ireland, but anywhere where English was spoken. Whereas now, the distance between what's happening in American poetry and what's happening, say, in your work is really very great. And I can actually still feel the influence of Yeats's actual working out of those issues to do with the concrete, the abstract, to do with the repetition of sound patterns, to do with how much of the heroic or how much of the reference you can put into a poem. That is something that you're still working out in your own work.
Yeah, and in each poem, I don't think there's ever a set of rules or steps someone can take to write a poem. Each poem has its own physics, and there are poems where a very explicit account of Troy or reference to Troy in that way would work. For me, just for my ear, for my taste, that poem is unbalanced. I think that this question of how we make these decisions is a difficult one, because of course we don't do it consciously, but then we have to become conscious of the decisions we've made and test them. And so I always think of Ivor Gurney's poetry made in 8 Miles Walking. The work is done in this kind of rhythm, reverie that we get into, but then you do have to become conscious, and not of where it's come from, but what it might be, and draw it through, and then make sure it has its precision and logic. One of the things that drives me crazy is this very slack use of the word poetic, which is to mean all things poetry isn't, and it's to mean kind of vague and soppy. And just because poetry is good at describing vagueness or uncertainty, but poetry has to be really precise. So that pull, it's Coleridge's thing of order and emotion, that you have to work at those two extremes. And if I've learned anything, I don't think I've learned very much at all in writing poetry since I was about 4 years old, is that you just have to try harder each time to recognise the moment at which you need to move from letting the back of your head work to bringing, working from the front of the head, and when you need to step away and when you need to just go and take a phrase for a walk and turn it over in the body, because that's how often things are solved. But one phrase that's important to me is Eliot's phrase of withdrawal from form, because I think that's what I took you, that sort of area is what I took you to be referring to when you said that Yeats became conscious of the limits. Not that there are limits, but that we are working in tension and should be working in tension with expectation and possibility.
Lavinia, I loved your description and the way you spoke about Leda and the Swan, and it's extremely interesting. And it brought back to my memory, I thought it was absolutely right about the poem. I thought it was absolutely eloquent about its power. But I can remember about, I suppose, the 1960s, standing up in Hodges Figgis, and Conor Cruise O'Brien's essay, that when he read Leda and the Swan, he knew Yeats was a fascist. That was, this long essay on the identification of Yeats as fascism, which this is not the moment to address all that, but it's very interesting. That's an extremely dark poem.
It is, and being caught up in fascists, how many people get caught up in
and I thought what you said was absolutely right. I suppose I've always also thought of it as just very pessimistic about the generation of history as a destructive and almost remorseless process. But very much what you said, this real ambivalence in what's happening in it.
Okay, I think we're going to end on that, and I want to thank you for your contribution, and thank you all for coming. And thank you.
I had thought of an adjective some moments ago, and I'm actually going to continue to use it, and that is that the evening has been magnificent. I'll reclaim the word. And as I listened to our four speakers, I was just so grateful that thanks to the help of Andrew Fogarty and Ailish O'Brien that we've recorded this, because I think for those of us who are teachers, I think we're very struck that we heard from four magnificent creators, but also four magnificent teachers. And it's wonderful that what we've heard this evening can go out into the world. I also want to briefly thank Anne Fogarty, Lucy Collins, Colleen English, Eve Carney, Betty Maguire and Ruth Ferguson. And then to finish the evening, I'd like to call on another Senator, Senator Susan O'Keefe, who's going to give a vote of thanks. Please join us for a glass. If you don't know many people here, just walk up to the person next to you and say, what's your favourite Yeats poem? So, Susan.
And they will all undoubtedly have a magnificent poem to offer. I want to say thank you particularly to our four contributors tonight. What an extraordinary evening, what an extraordinarily balanced evening, and what a entertaining, informative, thought-provoking. So really thank you all very, very much indeed. We all, I think, really appreciate it. I would like, if I might, on behalf of Yeats 2015, of which I'm chair, to thank UCD particularly for organising this evening in this beautiful room, which certainly lends an extraordinary feeling to the event. The year is designed really to create a space, in all kinds of spaces, to celebrate Yeats, not to commemorate him. It is very particularly about celebrating, and that celebration takes many forms, including an interrogation of his work, a disagreement with his work, a disagreement with him, if need be, but also, as I said, in that guise of being a celebration. And if you consider in this last week alone, I had the pleasure of being in Utrecht, at Utrecht University with the Irish ambassador in the Netherlands, John Neary, and of course Dr. Lucy Collins was with us there also, and we had a very interesting two-day session about the more academic aspects of some of Yeats' work. And it was followed that evening with the Utrecht Guild of Poets, who are all published poets who'd come together over the months since last year and had each chosen a Yeats poem and then published and written their own poem in a response and published a lovely small book. So that was last Friday and Saturday. On Sunday, in Sligo, on Strida Beach, about 500 people gathered for a performance of On Ballia Strand by the Blue Raincoat Theatre Company. On Tuesday, again in Sligo, the Indian ambassador and the Indian Minister for External Affairs were in Sligo to unveil a bust which they had donated to Sligo of Rabindranath Tagore. On Wednesday, I received in the post some leaflets that had been done by Cork City Library in response to Yeats 2015, where they chose a number of poems and translated them into different languages: Swedish, Polish, Russian, Latvian, French and German. And they're looking actually for an Irish poem, which they couldn't find. And Martin Enright, the president of the Yeats Society, who's with us this evening, I know is going to provide me with that at the end. But the point being that that was their way of reaching out to their local community and including people from other countries in Cork, and they've been giving out these and they will continue to do so all year. In Thursday, again in Sligo, we had a classic no theatre performance from a young woman from Japan who is a trained classic no theatre performer in response, of course, to Yeats' own interest in no theatre. And here we are tonight in Dublin, having just listened to a superb discussion and heard a really interesting conversation about Yeats. So that's just 1 week in this amazing year. And what's happened is that the space has been filled and continues to be filled by people in the visual arts, in music, dance, poetry, drama. From the smallest, the youngest children we had performing this year were 3, and certainly we've had Edna O'Brien, who is willing to say that she's 84, perform on the eve of Yeats Day in Sligo and tell us that for her word actually, not magnificent, was simply amazing. She said that Yeats grows more amazing as she grows older. And so I leave you with that thought. I wanted to thank particularly the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht for funding and supporting this year of Yeats as we lead into 2016. And I want very particularly to thank President Michael D. Higgins, who's the patron of the year. And again, to thank you all and to keep the flag of Yeats flying and keep it close to your heart. Thank you.